and I'll do a brief introduction, and then you can take it away. Does that work?
That works fine.
Okay. Welcome to the third day of our Pride Lunch and Learn workshop. I hope you guys are all excited for at Astra with Pride. We've had a wonderful week so far. We've got today our Pride Lunch and Learn workshop, followed by tonight we have our LGBTQ activist panel led by author CJ Genovi. She will be talking to some panelists that she interviewed for her book, No Place Like Home, Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas. Tomorrow afternoon for our final Pride Lunch and Learn workshop, we have Dr. Levitt from K-State, who will be talking about intersectionality. Followed by that night, Friday night, we will have our Pride Hangout. So register on our Facebook page to come hang out with us on Zoom, learn more about Project Q&A and how to get involved, connect with other people, and play some fun virtual Zoom games. And then our main event is on Saturday at 6:30. So tune into Facebook to watch our main event. We have drag performers from all across the United States, musicians from the Midwest, and some amazing keynote speakers. So today's Pride Lunch and Learn workshop is LGBTQ history, and we are very grateful to have Stuart Hinds, who is the coordinator of special collections and archives at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. So welcome, Stuart.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad to be talking to everyone across Southeast Kansas. I have direct family ties to that area. My mom was born in Independence. She grew up in Chetopa. My dad worked for the Frisco Railroad and traveled from Monette in Southwest Missouri, where I grew up, to Neodesha for like 31 years. So you all are my people in more ways than one. So today what I wanted to do was talk about drag history, performative drag, and in particular, performative drag in Kansas City during the period between World War I and World War II. It's actually pretty interesting and pretty surprising once you start looking at it. And so to look at it, I want to get my PowerPoint up here and share it with you all. Okay, so this is the formal title from Proscenium to Inferno, the Interwar Transformation of Female Impersonation in Kansas City. And so we're talking about the period 1920s and 1930s, essentially, the Roaring 20s and the Depressed 30s, as they have been called. So this is the Orpheum Theater in downtown Kansas City. It was opened on December 26, 1914, and when it opened, it was the nicest theater in the city. It was a palace. It was located on 12th Street. If you know downtown Kansas City, it was located on 12th Street, or excuse me, just south of 12th Street on Baltimore. And the building was designed by an acoustics expert who worked on the Paris Opera House. The exterior was terracotta that was made to look like marble. There were carved wooden panels throughout the theater. It had a terracotta floor. The auditorium was supported by these giant columns that were situated such that no view was obstructed, no view of the stage. The seats themselves were mahogany with leather upholstery, and in the auditorium, the ceiling was painted to resemble a nighttime sky. It really was a true palace. And because it was so nice, it drew a high society crowd. Lots and lots of people came to the Orpheum, and most of those were the cream of Kansas City society. The Kansas City Club, which was an exclusive private club, actually reserved an entire row each season for Kansas City Club members. It was that Tony, and much of the entertainment, oddly enough, that was consumed by these folks was vaudeville. Vaudeville emerged in the late 19th century in the United States as really a reaction to sort of bawdy, boisterous, really adult-oriented entertainment that was taking place in music halls. As the country industrialized in the late 19th century and families moved from rural settings to urban centers, they were really looking for more family-friendly entertainment. They wanted someplace they could take their kids. And music halls were not such a place. And so vaudeville gets started in reaction to that, primarily from about 1880 to 1930. And it really was quite successful, not only in Kansas City, but throughout the country. And it was the start of entertainment as show business. It was really a business. They looked at it as such. And it was the beginning of what we would now call circuit theaters. There were chains of theaters across the United States, that had it's common to us today, but it was a novelty then. They had a home office, typically in New York, and then they had venues in cities across the country. There was an Orpheum chain, there was a Schubert chain, there was a Pantages chain. These were scattered all across the country, and they featured typical vaudeville kinds of entertainment, magicians, singers, comics. But what they also featured, which might be surprising, were female impersonators. Female impersonation was a holdover from minstrel shows. The first recorded minstrel impersonator in the United States is 1835. It goes back that far. And they were a standard in vaudeville. During the 50-year heyday, again, roughly about 1880 to 1930, a number of different impersonators enjoyed really successful careers. And before I forget, there were also male impersonators. That's outside this. I don't have time to talk about them today. They were largely popular in the very late part of the 19th century. Maybe we'll do that next year. But anyway, so like I said, they were popular 1880 to 1930, and a number of them had very successful careers and frankly became household names. They were that famous. During Prohibition, which starts in 1919, the tradition of female impersonation expands into nightclubs and cabarets, and drew even bigger crowds at that point, particularly in cities like New York and Chicago. But as Prohibition goes away, and tastes change, and oversight of those cabarets and nightclubs happens, we start to see female impersonation disappear, except in Kansas City, and we'll find out why in a little bit. The practice in Kansas City continued and remained popular into the late 1930s. Now, given that vaudeville was supposed to be family fun, family entertainment, good, clean fun, it might seem unusual that female impersonators were such a big part of vaudeville. But impersonators during vaudeville were different than what we today in the 21st century see in performances by drag queens. Back then, their performances were typically incorporated into skits or longer theatrical pieces, and they had a wide range. They could be exaggeratedly comic, or they could be empathetically tragic, and everything in between. Most female impersonators were singers. They sang their own songs, and they became very well known for the quality of their acts. In looking into this, in the research that I've done, I've been able to identify about 135 vaudeville performers who were known as female impersonators. And of those, there's evidence that about 35 came through Kansas City in some of these circuit theaters. And like I said, the range of the types of impersonators varied widely. But fortunately, Kansas City audiences got to experience shows more than once featuring two of the most famous impersonators during vaudeville, Julian Eltinge, the guy on the left, and Bert Savoy, the actor there in drag, with his partner, his performance partner, Jay Brennan. Not only were these two performers enormously talented and popular, but they also represent really contradictory aspects of drag performance during this time. So as a teenager, Julian Eltinge trained as a dancer around Boston. And his instructor, he was so good, he was very graceful, and his instructor encouraged him to pursue female impersonation. Up to this point, impersonators pretty much fell into two different camps, the broadly comedic and the perfectly passing illusionist. That was the goal, was to give the illusion of being a woman. Eltinge decided to focus on that and was immediately successful. He focused on every detail necessary to maintain the illusion, from his extraordinary costumes to his hair to makeup to movement, and he performed costumed and choreographed vignettes in larger vaudeville shows, little skits. And the quality of both his illusion and his performance quickly became legendary, such that by 1910, one critic considered him as great a performer as there stands on the stage today. This is 110 years ago. Eltinge essentially was the pinnacle of female impersonation during this time, and he performed in a number of different shows. This is a cover of a piece of sheet music from one of his most famous shows, The Fascinating Widow, and this is from 1910, and extracted the image of Eltinge in his man drag and then in his bridal drag. He was a big man. He was about 6'3", and he weighed about 240 pounds. And when he would costume up, he had about a 38-inch waist. And when he would costume up and get corseted, his waist would be shrunk to he'd lose about 10 inches to about 28 inches. And it was an extraordinary transformation, like I said, because he was so big. And that just helped to, because people saw pictures of him as a man, right? And so that just helped to contribute to the transformation and to his success. He was a really interesting character, though. He complained throughout his career about having to do female impersonation, and he complained about having to go to such great lengths to be an impersonator, and he gave the impression of being clearly uncomfortable with his chosen trade, but his discomfort extended beyond the change in his appearance. He took great pains to ensure that his audiences understood that he was acting. Off stage, he he was a paragon of traditionally masculine behaviors, and he would take pictures of those behaviors and get them published all the time to emphasize this notion of the fact that he was an actor performing. So he would stage these photos of him boxing, doing traditional manly things, right? Boxing or hunting or fishing, doing farming activities. When he would get teased by stagehands or people behind the scenes, he actually would get into real fistfights with them, and these were regularly reported in the press. He did whatever it took to distance himself from the perceived femininity that was associated with his chosen career, despite the fact that it was really, really lucrative for him. He was insanely successful. Julian Eltinge was the RuPaul of his day. He was that well known across the United States, and he branched out, and he had his own magazine that was distributed nationally that started in 1913. It was full of beauty and makeup tips. He had his own line of makeup that was distributed nationally. He had his own theater in New York that still stands today, and he eventually transferred from vaudeville into film. And this is a poster of a film that he was in with Rudolph Valentino, one of the major film stars of the silent era. All the films that he starred in, all the films that he was in were silent films. And he was so popular as a film star that in Kansas City, in 1917, films featuring Julian Eltinge were played in different theaters across Kansas City for 9 full months. They would go from theater. There were lots of neighborhood theaters at that time, and these films that featured Eltinge played in these various theaters over the course of an academic year, 9 months. And this is the Schubert Theater where he performed on stage. He was in Kansas City for about around 6 different times between 1913 and 1921 on stage. And then, of course, like I said, his films were also playing throughout the city as well. And this is this kills me. So obviously he has a lot of skill in giving the illusion of being a woman. And this is a piece from the Kansas City Star, which was traditionally a very conservative paper. And this is it takes up about half a page. This is just part of the article. And it's an article that coincides with one of his appearances here on stage. And in the article, he berates Kansas City women for their lack of fashion sense. He talks about how if he can do it and become a beautiful woman, they should be able to do it as well. So it's, again, from 1913. So at the other end of this feminine masculine spectrum that Eltinge sort of railed against was this performer, Bert Savoy. He teamed with a partner, Jay Brennan, the gentleman in the man's clothes, and Savoy's shtick was to portray a dim but fast-talking, witty woman who spouted incessant rants about the gossip that she'd heard from her friend Margie. And she talked really, really fast. She relayed this gossip with campy speed to Brennan, and Brennan would just sort of goad her on. He was a straight man. And Savoy had a supply of stock phrases, pet phrases that were long associated with his character. Phrases like, "You must come along," "You don't know the half of it, dearie," My nerves is all unstrung. You slay me. You must come over. Some historians claim that Mae West appropriated this last phrase and made it her own with some minor alterations. The classic "come up and see me sometime." Interestingly, Savoy and Brennan were one of the few, if maybe the only one that I can find, drag vaudeville acts to be recorded. This is an ad for a recording that was made in 1923, and you get a real sense of what Savoy was like. And I'm going to try and play it, and hopefully you all will be able to hear it. It's only about a minute long.
Well, what's the hurry? What's the hurry? Where are you going?
Are you speaking to me? You're speaking to me. Are you speaking to me?
Yes, I was going to ask you to have something to eat.
Well, who frightened you?
Well, where have you been? Shopping?
No, Marky and I went to the matinee. We went to the matinee. Oh, I was mad over it. We went to the matinee.
Just you and Margie?
No, I met a lovely fellow in the lobby. He was fussy, but he was a lovely fella.
Was he a New York boy or
No, he was a college boy. He wasn't in college. He was a college boy.
Well, how do you know?
We had a Yale lock in his pocket.
So you must have had a wonderful trip to Europe last
Oh,
year.
I'm glad you asked me.
And some very thrilling.
Oh, you don't know the half of it, Judy. You don't know the half of it.
Tell me of some of your experiences.
Oh, listen, one night when the ship was in mid-ocean, it stopped.
Yes?
Just then the captain came along, and Mark said, "What's the matter?" And the captain said the rudder spoke. And I'll never forget Margie about it.
Go on. The captain said the rudder broke. And what did Margie say?
Margie says, "That's all right. It's underneath. Nobody'll notice it."
So typical vaudeville humor. The first joke was the boy that she met was a college boy because he had a Yale lock in his pocket. It's a brand of locks that was famous then. It's still around today. And then, of course, the rudder underneath the ship was broken and no one could see it. So Savoy was a little more lowbrow and a little more earthy than El Tinge. Savoy's main deal was not necessarily to pass as a woman, but to be a comedic kind of character. Despite that, he was just as attentive to his wardrobe and the other components of the illusion as El Tinge. But he just carried them out in a much more outrageous way. Unlike El Tinge, though, off stage, he was equally outlandish. He was openly gay. He regularly employed feminine pronouns when referring to himself and a cadre of like-minded friends. And unlike other female impersonators, he remained in costume and in character off stage. Even at the end of his life, he was a master of camp. On June 26, 1923, Savoy and a theater colleague were strolling on Long Beach in New York when a thunderstorm broke out. After an exceedingly loud clap of thunder, Savoy was reported to have said, "Mercy, ain't Miss God cutting up something awful?" There was an immediate bolt of lightning from the sky that struck both Savoy and his companion dead. So campy to the very end. Savoy and Brennan played at the Orpheum typically. They played in Kansas City 4 or 5 times, almost as many times as El Tinge. So Prohibition starts in 1919, and it tended to be ignored by a lot of people, frankly. It obviously was not a success. And as people broke the law, it was a constitutional amendment. As people broke the law by consuming alcohol, nightlife that accompanied alcohol consumption really changed during this time and became essentially criminalized. It had a criminal element to it. And because the people in the nightclub were breaking the law by consuming liquor, therefore, there was a sensibility that emerged during this time that manifested itself in the acceptance of more risque and criminal other behaviors as well. And as a result, these club goers were more receptive to alternative forms of entertainment than they ever had been before. And this was particularly evident in their acceptance of both female and male impersonation. What happens in New York and in other cities, not necessarily in Kansas City, but what emerges over the course of the decade plus of Prohibition, the 1920s, is what becomes known as the pansy craze. Particularly in New York, you have these big, giant drag balls in Harlem and in Greenwich Village, and they tend to draw big straight crowds who want to come and be illicit and be dangerous and watch the people who are parading around in drag. I mean, these balls were huge. They would draw upwards of 6,000 people and be regularly reported in some of the more tabloidy kinds of newspapers. And that just spills over into other cities, and this notion of acceptance of these more not necessarily radical, but non-traditional kinds of forms of entertainment become more popular. In Kansas City, nightlife was, during this time, nightlife in the 20s and 30s was centered in two areas, essentially, along 12th Street in downtown and in the neighborhood around 18th and Vine. 18th and Vine had become a bustling business district for Black citizens of Kansas City, in large part because they were officially prevented from living in any other part of the city. There were all sorts of restrictions that prevented Black people from moving outside of a very well-defined area. And so this neighborhood around 18th and Vine becomes a bustling business district, as well as home to a variety of different types of nightlife, both legitimate and illegitimate, illicit. It's in this neighborhood that we start, this neighborhood and the 12th Street district, that we start to see the emergence of what becomes known as Kansas City jazz. These are some of the musicians, the Black musicians affiliated with the Black Musicians Union, the building for which is still down at 18th in the 18th and Vine Entertainment District. So not only does the entertainment kind of change because of the criminalized nature of nightlife, in Kansas City in particular, the more predominant factor is that the city is overseen by a crime boss, a guy named Tom Pendergast. Not necessarily mafia, but because Pendergast was Irish, so maybe Irish mafia you could call it, but it's a little different. Pendergast ruled with an iron fist. I mean, he literally ruled the city. And as a result, the controls that you would normally see in place were not. And so clubs were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You could find any sort of alcohol. You could find any sort of drugs. You could find any sort of sex, any time of the day, almost anywhere. And gambling. So Kansas City is referred to as a wide open town during this time. And a lot of that activity takes place in nightclubs like this. These are some of the clubs that were around, again, along 12th Street and in the 18th and Vine district during this period. A vast difference from the Orpheum Theater, where we talked about seeing some of these female impersonators. during this time. There are references to, a number of references to cabaret-based female impersonators. This newspaper ad is one. This is from a Black newspaper, the Kansas City American from 1931. The club is just north of 18th and Vine, and not only in newspaper advertisements, but also in interviews with some of the musicians who played at these clubs, provide documentation of female impersonation. So this guy, Herman Walder, the guy who's got the clarinet in his hand, standing up, he was known as a saxophonist. And he, in an interview about the history of Kansas City jazz, he talks about the female impersonators who performed at the club. They had female impersonators, this is a quote, they had female impersonators mostly. They were sharp too. One of them was named Billy. That's the one that I'd like to have a fight over. They would come from out of town, song and dance. They had all kinds of artists. In the Black clubs, they had female impersonators night on Monday, so-and-so's night, Tuesday. The next night was men's night. They'd come on out, they had female impersonators, they'd come on out, and everybody else, they'd come see them. The acceptance of the impersonators by Walder and other musicians was actually fairly common. To quote him again, "We judge people by what they want to be themselves. You dig what I mean?" And those people were good. They were always good to you. They'd fill up the kitty, man. If they made some money, they'd come and fill up the kitty. The kitty was a cat-shaped receptacle, usually at the foot of the stage, where people would drop in their tips. And so obviously Walder is talking about the female impersonators who would put their tips in the kitty. This performer, Booker T. Washington, was a trumpet player, and he described impersonators at a club called the Spinning Wheel, which was located on 12th Street. The place consists more of female impersonators. That was featured. Each of them would do something different. They had a special to do. Each one of them, they dressed like women. They stayed dressed like women. They went around throughout the crowd as women, and they didn't. Wasn't nothing funny or faking with them. They were genuine. They were hired. They had between 6 and 8 of them, and they worked every night. In fact, the most of them, that's where most of our money came from, the impersonators. They'd go out and do their numbers, and they would get tips, and what tips they'd get, they'd throw in the kitty. So again, the collaborative nature of these female impersonators in these clubs, as evidenced by these musicians' recollections. So prohibition is repealed in 1933 because it's a complete failure. And when it is repealed, government authorities get involved again in the oversight of liquor manufacturing and distribution, but they also become way more involved in the spaces in which liquor is consumed, because they've seen the evolution of these nightclubs and the unsavory activities that take place in them. And so they view this as an opportunity to kind of put the clamp down on these nightclubs and speakeasies. And they do that. And as a result, these nightclubs become, in many cities, these nightclubs begin to assume sort of a middle-class respectability that they didn't have when things were a little dicier. So by the mid-1930s, cities across the United States had either legally banned female impersonation, or changing audience tastes had driven female impersonation out of the cabaret scene. There were raids on drag clubs in Los Angeles that resulted in arrests of both performers and audience members. In Chicago, clubs were routinely harassed and even closed with the support of the mayor. Female impersonators at a club in Seattle were replaced by honky-tonk music. And in New York, which was the center of the pansy craze, the end of that craze began in 1931 with a campaign by local newspapers against the clubs that featured female impersonation. And this led to police crackdowns on individual clubs and eventually on those drag balls. Even smaller cities across the United States became more restrictive when it came to drag. In the first 3 months of 1935, impersonators were actually chased out of New York out of Milwaukee, and out of St. Paul, Minnesota. It got to such a point that in 1940, shortly before he passed away, Julian Eltinge was out in Los Angeles. And because he could not, it was illegal at that point for him to perform as a female impersonator. What he would do, sadly, is do these shows, and he would be on stage and he would hold up the dresses that he used to wear and tell stories about the shows or the performance, but he couldn't wear them because it was illegal. But in Kansas City, even though the liquor control ordinance had been revised in 1934 to reflect the repeal of prohibition, it was a different story. The city was still being ruled by this crime boss, Tom Pendergast, and so the revisions that were made to the liquor code were primarily for show, more than anything else. They didn't have any teeth to them. Social life went on as before. These clubs are still open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and with the added benefit that since Pendergast controlled city officials, he had an easier time controlling. He had an even easier time controlling the distribution and sale of liquor and drugs. And the loosening of alcohol restrictions meant that there were more clubs that could legally be open. And these clubs could advertise now legally. And so we see more evidence of female impersonation during this time in Kansas City. Because again, it's not illegal here. The city's wide open. And so female impersonation is still going strong in Kansas City after the repeal of prohibition. And there's only 2 or 3 other cities in the United States where that happens. San Francisco and New Orleans are the primary ones. So this is an ad from one of the 12th Street clubs for 1935, 2 years after the repeal of prohibition, that talks about the lineup, and that it includes Tuesdays being female impersonators from something called Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno was a nightclub that opened literally the day prohibition was repealed, and it becomes the center of female impersonation during this period, during the post-prohibition period. It was located at Independence Avenue and Troost. If you know downtown Kansas City, essentially east of City Market. And like I said, it opened immediately following repeal and becomes known as the site of female impersonation. This is an interior of the club. It had a hell theme. It was painted red. All sorts of demons and devils. At one point, it was designed such that a person in costume would be camouflaged by the wall and then would reach out and scare people. And the waitresses wore little devil costumes. They had little devil horns and long tails. And it featured female impersonators who were still traveling through where they could in the country, because there weren't that many venues left for them to perform. So we saw a regular array of different performers in Kansas City at this club, including some of these folks. This was Mr. Half and Half, who would turn and display the female side of his body and sing in the female voice, and then turn and display the male side and sing in a male voice. These are some other performers who came through town. This is Billy Richards, who was based out of Seattle and was a regular performer at Dante's. And the reason we have all these photos and this information is because of this woman, Edna Mae Whithouse. Edna Mae was born in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, in the first part of the 20th century, and her family relocated to Kansas City when she was a child. They lived in Midtown, and her father was a religious singer, and she was a singer as well, but she took her vocal talents in a completely different direction, becoming both a waitress and a performer at Dante's shortly after it opened. She was part of the floor show, and she was billed as Eddie and was paired in a duo with that female impersonator, Billy Richards, that Seattle-based performer. They performed regularly as the Lynn sisters, and there's some evidence that Edna May passed herself off as a female impersonator. So a woman pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman, 50 years before the movie Victor Victoria, which is a story about just that, starring Julie Andrews. So, like I said, they become known as the Lynn sisters, and they were extremely popular with audiences, and they were extremely popular with the local entertainment press. They got written up all the time. This is Edna May and Billy Richards, Eddie and Billy. And she talked about Dante's when they first got female impersonators. And it's a quote: "When we first got them, the audiences were curious. People didn't know what to make of them, but the longer we had them, the more they liked them. They'd invite them to sit and they'd buy drinks for them. The only thing we had trouble with, the African-American boys would make cracks to them. They slapped a couple of them, which is bad. Theirs, the impersonators, it's just a business. It's nothing personal. It wasn't safe to have them around these young men, but Brother Jim, who was the owner of the club, straightened him up. He said, 'Don't you bother these guys.' The other gays had come down to see him. Everybody would come to see them." Woodhouse worked at Dante's for not quite 3 years. She was recruited for a touring version of a show called The Follies in 1936, and she left Dante's at that time. She later came back to Kansas City and opened up a club in Riverside, if you know where Riverside is, north of Kansas City, north of downtown, the other side of the river. And the building that she opened it, ironically enough, was a building that had been built by Tom Pendergast. But despite the fact that she was gone from Dante's, you still see lots of female impersonation late into the decade. This is, again, another club on 12th Street, and this is very late. This is 1938. The town is still wide open for about another year, because what happens is Pendergast gets arrested for tax evasion in 1939 and goes to jail, goes to prison. And as a result, you see the cleanup of the city start to happen after that, and female impersonation completely goes away by that point. So much so that by the start of World War II, female impersonation disappears from civilian life in Kansas City and elsewhere. But ironically enough, there's plenty of evidence to show that the practice took place in the military, but that's another story. Prior to the start of World War II, there was one performer, a performer named Ray Bourbon, who would prove to be a longstanding feature in Kansas City drag. This is one of his performances at Dante's in 1935. Bourbon was internationally known, had been performing as an impersonator since the teens, and he was featured at Dante's several times. Edna May talked about him, calling him one of the world's greatest, I guess second to El Tinge. He did an awful lot of swishing, but he didn't wear drag. He dressed real classy. How ultra he was. He worked for us at Dante's 4 times. He was a headliner, as we saw from the ad. After World War II, Bourbon toured across the country, across the United States, but he encountered difficulty trying to make a living as a female impersonator. So much so that by the early 1960s, he had permanently relocated to Kansas City to end his career at the infamous Jewel Box Lounge, which was a club that was known nationally in the 1960s as a center of female impersonation. It was on the circuit. Bourbon released a number of recordings up to and during this time, both on 78 and on LP, including this live performance from the Jewel Box in 1962. He was extremely popular with local audiences, and his story is really, really amazing, but it is a story for another day. For now, Bourbon provides a direct link between the 1960s, which is also another really interesting period in Kansas City drag history, and the 1930s, which we obviously have talked about this afternoon. So with that, I will say thank you and take any questions that you all might have.
We have a few questions. That was really informative, and who knew that the Midwest had such a rich drag culture?
I know, it's really, really incredible. Once you start looking, it's really, really amazing.
Yeah. One of the questions we had was, so with the times of like Eltinge and Savoy, female impersonation, how did that align with like the culture at the time when it was so prevalent in vaudeville? How was that general society looked on female?
It was really a high-end form of entertainment because like Eltinge and Savoy to a certain extent, the goal was to be an illusionist, and that's what people paid attention to, was how well the impersonator became a woman, a woman as it was defined during that period, a Gibson girl in many respects. And Eltinge was really, really good at it, and that's why he became so popular. And it was a form of entertainment that appealed to all levels of society. I mean, you had high society people going to and being impressed by these impersonators. So it's really a different kind of female impersonation than we think of today.
The next question we had was, how come the early days of drag isn't talked about as much? And it's kind of just starting in like the 80s with the ballroom culture and things like that.
I don't know. That's the thing that really surprised me when I started doing this research about 8 years ago. I was asked to do it for a presentation because we got a collection in the Gay and Lesbian Archive here at UMKC from a drag queen, a local drag queen who'd been performing for a long time. And when I started looking, I'd never heard of Julie and Eltinge. And when I started looking, I was amazed. And I honestly don't know why it's not talked about or it's not taught more, because it's really, really interesting. And it's really surprising that it was such an aspect of legitimate theater for so long. So that's why I'm doing presentations like this, is to get the word out.
We had another question. Are any of the buildings from the pictures, are they still standing today in Kansas City?
The nightclubs are all pretty much gone. I mean, they were pretty ratty little buildings to begin with. The Orpheum is gone. The Jewel Box, that later club, actually is still standing. And there's been some talk here in town about trying to get it on the National Register. The folks who do the National Register are really interested in preserving sites of LGBTQ history, like Stonewall and other places. And so they're reaching out to cities that still have sites like that. And so we're talking about doing a nomination form for the building that was the Jewel Box.
One of our viewers said that she can remember, she grew up in the Kansas City area and can remember the Jewel Box, although she never went there. We had another question. Are there any books that we can look for on this topic?
I'm working on a book on Kansas City history that will include some of this. There are some, there's a really good book on male impersonation by a professor I think she's at Illinois or Wisconsin. She wrote a book on the male impersonators. I will send you a list of some titles of some books and or articles to share with folks.
Okay, awesome. And then one last question. Are there any connections to Southeast Kansas from any of these performers? I know you mentioned Oklahoma.
You know, I was thinking about that, and I realized this morning that the presentation that I should have put together is a presentation on a performer named Billy Tipton. I don't know if any of the viewers have heard of that name before, but Billy Tipton has ties to Kansas City, went to high school in Kansas City, and then performed throughout Southeast Kansas and Northeast Oklahoma as a jazz performer in the 30s. Was based in Joplin for a while and then traveled kind of throughout the mining area, Galena and that area. The thing about Billy Tipton is Billy Tipton was born a girl and went to high school as a girl. And then during the Depression, when he had trouble finding work, he started wearing men's clothes and found lots of work, and then presented as a man the rest of his life, and no one knew about it. He was married to 3 different women. None of the women knew about it. With his last wife, he adopted 2 boys. The boys didn't know. A really, really, really interesting story with direct ties, obviously, to Southeast Kansas. And it was by the time I realized this morning, it was too late to put something together, but we may do that. If I'm lucky enough to be invited back next year, we may talk about Billy Tipton because it's a really interesting story.
Well, today there was a very interesting presentation today. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have in the chat.
All right, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be able to do it.
Thank you.